Poor single father with hunger in a bakery, until a millionaire finds him and changes his life. It was a gray morning at Pike Place Market, where the air of Seattle carried the smell of fresh fish and warm bread. Daniel Costa stood among the crowd, one hand gripping the empty wallet in the pocket of his worn-out jacket. Beside him, Sophia, his 8-year-old daughter, clutched his sleeve, her eyes fixed on the golden loaves just pulled from the oven, their scent almost unbearable. Daniel swallowed hard. He pretended to be choosing, though in truth he was just buying time so Sophia could look a little longer. His voice cracked slightly as he asked, "How much for the multi-grain loaf?" $4 for the large one, sir," the baker replied without looking up. Daniel nodded, forcing a polite smile, then turned to his daughter. "We'll have oatmeal when we get home, sweetheart." Sophia nodded obediently, though her gaze lingered longingly on the bread before she turned away. He tightened his grip on her tiny hand. The smell of the bread twisted painfully in his stomach. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. Across the street, Elena Duarte, a woman in her mid-30s wearing a cream-colored coat, waited in line for coffee. She noticed him, the tall man whose eyes carried both pride and quiet despair. She didn't know why she hesitated, only that she couldn't just walk away. When she approached, Daniel thought she was about to offer him money. He tensed, gripping the strap of his backpack, his voice rough with shame. "Thank you, but I don't take handouts." Elena smiled softly. "I know, and I'm not offering one. I just need someone to help me restore my garden." Daniel blinked, startled. "I'm not sure I know much about gardening." "You only need hands that know how to listen," she said gently. "I'll pay fairly, just a few hours' work." Sophia looked up at her father, hope flickering in her wide eyes. Daniel exhaled slowly. He could tell there was no pity in the woman's tone, only sincerity, and that made it impossible to refuse. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll write down the address," Elena replied, jotting it quickly on a napkin. "It's a house by the bay in the Magnolia District." She handed him the note and turned to leave. Daniel stood still for a long moment, holding that piece of paper like a fragile lifeline. He looked at Sophia and whispered, "Looks like your dad might have a job tomorrow." The girl's face lit up with her first smile of the day. And in that instant, amid the city noise, Daniel felt something stir inside his chest, a fragile but real kind of hope. As they walked away from the market, the pale sunlight caught Sophia's brown hair, turning it almost golden. Daniel glanced back at the bakery one last time. He knew that tomorrow might be a beginning, small, but still a beginning. The next morning, Seattle was wrapped in a thin mist. Daniel Costa pushed his old bicycle up the hill, a small toolbox strapped to the back. Inside were scissors, pruning shears, wire, and gloves, tools once used to study coral, now repurposed to tend a forgotten garden. Elena Duarte's house stood on a slope overlooking Elliott Bay, a white wooden home framed by a faded fence. When Daniel stopped, the gate creaked, a weary sound, as if the garden itself sighed after years of neglect. Elena opened the door with a gentle smile. "You're right on time." "I've always followed the tides," Daniel replied, half joking. She led him to the backyard. The garden stretched out before them, tangled grass, dead leaves covering the paths, wilted flowers drooping under the morning mist. In one corner stood a row of white roses, nearly dead, their stems brittle and bare. "My grandmother planted these," Elena said softly. "She passed away 2 years ago. No one has touched this garden since." Daniel knelt, brushing soil from one of the roots. Though dry, he could still feel the faint pulse of life beneath. "They're still breathing," he murmured. "They just need someone to remind them how." Elena watched him silently, the way his hands moved carefully, how his expression softened when he touched each plant. There was something in him that felt steady, respectful, not only toward the work, but toward life itself. When he started clearing the weeds, she went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee. "You've done this before?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Not exactly. I used to study marine life, coral, algae, underwater ecosystems. Now, I mostly study survival." They both laughed quietly, the sound blending with the distant rhythm of waves. They worked through the morning. Daniel trimmed and dug, replaced broken pots. Elena helped gather leaves and wash containers, sometimes watching him in silence. A brief beam of sunlight pierced the Seattle clouds, glinting off the silver strands in his hair. During a break, they sat beneath the maple tree, coffee cups still warm in their hands. Elena said, "I didn't expect you to understand plants so deeply." "They're not so different from us," Daniel replied. "When forgotten, they close in on themselves. But with a bit of care, they always find a way to live again." His words hung in the air. Elena looked toward the row of white roses and whispered, "Maybe. I'm a bit like this garden, too." Daniel turned to her, but she smiled, avoiding his gaze. As the sun began to set, the garden had completely transformed. The white roses were neatly trimmed, the wildflowers along the path arranged in soft order, and the backyard seemed awakened from a long sleep. Elena stood silently for a moment, then turned to Daniel. "I don't even know how to thank you. My grandmother would have smiled if she saw this." Daniel wiped his forehead, his tone modest and low. "It was just work, ma'am. I only did what I know best." Elena smiled and pulled a small envelope from her pocket. "This is what you've earned. And maybe a small thank you for the way you looked at this garden. With heart." Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to be seen as someone accepting pity, but the sincerity in her eyes made him nod. "Thank you. I really needed this job." Elena chuckled softly. "If you'd like, there's still more to be done here. I'm reopening the garden soon. I could use someone who understands that every plant deserves a chance to grow again." Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. There was something in it, a quiet invitation he couldn't quite name. "I'll think about it," he said gently. "Call me when you're ready," Elena replied, handing him a small card. He looked at it, nodded, and walked toward the gate. When he turned back, she was still standing there, the wind playing with her dress. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something warm stir inside him, something that felt like hope. Daniel left the garden as dusk settled. On his way home, he passed by the old bakery, the same place where just yesterday he had stood behind the glass, clutching his empty wallet. This time he stopped and opened the envelope. A small amount of money, but enough. He stepped inside. The warm scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. "2 loaves of barley bread, please," he said, his voice trembling slightly, as if afraid this moment might vanish like a dream. The baker smiled. "Both just came out of the oven, sir." Daniel took the still warm bag in his hands. A strange feeling spread through his chest, something both simple and sacred. When he reached the small apartment, Sophia ran to him, her messy hair bouncing, her smile radiant. "Bread!" she cried, hugging the bag like a treasure. Daniel sat down, watching his daughter take her first bite, crumbs clinging to her cheek. The last light of the day streamed through the window, bathing her innocent face in a tender, almost painful peace. And then, suddenly, the memories returned. He saw the image of the woman who had once been his wife, a face now fading into memory. She had left with all their savings, abandoning him and their child to face a mountain of debt. 2 days later, Daniel still kept Elena's business card tucked in his wallet, staring at it every time he opened it. His temporary park job had ended, and he wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But that morning, standing on his small balcony, looking at the wilting plants that needed care, he thought of her garden, a place that, somehow, felt like where he belonged. He took out his phone, hesitated for a heartbeat, and dialed. Elena's voice came through, warm and bright, like early spring sunlight. "Daniel, I was wondering when you'd call." "I think it's time to start again," he said. On the other end, she smiled. He could almost hear it. "Then come by. The garden is always open for those ready to begin again." Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket and stepped outside. Seattle's air was still damp, but to him the day felt lighter, as if something new had quietly begun. Daniel Costa returned to Elena's house wearing his old gloves and a faded shirt. He wasn't sure whether he looked forward more to the work or the conversation. As he entered through the creaking gate, the scent of damp soil and lavender welcomed him. Elena was bending over, trimming the last few stems of lavender. When she saw him, she smiled softly. "You're earlier than I expected." "I didn't want to keep the garden waiting," Daniel said quietly. They worked side by side, Daniel pruning the roses, Elena gathering dry leaves. The sound of shears, birds above the porch, and the distant crash of waves blended into a calm rhythm, as if the garden itself was learning to breathe again. During a break, Elena brought out a small tray with coffee and warm pastries. "I guessed you hadn't had breakfast." Daniel smiled, a little embarrassed. "You guessed right." They sat under the old maple tree, the warmth of the cups easing the chill of the ocean breeze. Elena studied his hands, tanned, scarred, strong. "You seem like someone who used to do something very different." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He turned the cup slowly before speaking. "I used to be a marine biologist. I studied coral reef restoration in the Pacific. It was my whole life, until everything collapsed." Elena didn't interrupt, but her eyes told him to go on. "There was a major project. I handled the funding. One mistake, or maybe one rash decision, and the money was gone. The media called me a fraud. The institute cut me off. My wife left." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "I lost everything except Sophia. She's the only reason I still get up every morning." Elena set her cup down gently on the wooden table. "I'm sorry, Daniel." "Don't be," he said softly. "I'm not looking for pity. Sometimes you just need to say it out loud, so the memory doesn't eat you alive." A breeze passed, carrying the scent of salt and lavender. Elena looked up at the gray-blue sky. "I understand that feeling." Daniel turned toward her. She smiled faintly. "My husband died in a car accident 2 years ago. After that, everything became empty. I tried to fill it with work, exhibitions, meetings, but the emptiness stayed." They sat in silence for a while. Only the sound of leaves and wind filled the air. Daniel spoke quietly. "Strange, isn't it? We're both trying to save something. You, your grandmother's memory. Me, the reefs. Maybe now, we're both trying to save ourselves." Elena looked at him, her eyes shimmering with understanding. "Maybe the garden knows better than we do. It's giving us both a place to begin again." A pause. No more words needed. Only the warmth of quiet recognition. Simple and real. As evening fell, Daniel glanced back at the white roses. In the late sunlight, they looked more alive, as if they had heard the confessions of 2 wounded souls. On his way home, Daniel felt lighter. He didn't know if it was the salt air or simply because, for the first time in years, he had told his truth without fear. It was a rare, clear evening in Seattle. The wind carried the scent of salt from Elliott Bay, rustling through the fading maple leaves. Daniel Costa walked into the familiar garden, this time wearing a clean shirt and a hint of nervous anticipation. The garden looked transformed, Trimmed grass, white roses blooming shyly, and tiny paper lanterns strung along every branch. The air smelled of flowers and sea breeze, soft and pure. Elena Duarte was arranging candles on a long wooden table. She wore a deep blue dress, her hair loose, the last light of day glinting in her brown eyes. "It looks beautiful," Daniel said, stopping a few steps away. Elena turned, smiling. "Thank you. Today marks 2 years since my grandmother passed. Every year I light lanterns and send them out to the bay." Daniel nodded. "A beautiful way to keep memories alive. My grandmother used to say, even the smallest light can guide a lost heart." Elena's voice was soft. "I think she'd like tonight." Guests began arriving, a few neighbors, Aunt Teresa, and close friends of Elena. They brought food, wine, laughter. Daniel helped hang the remaining lanterns, arrange the flowers. No one asked who he was, and he was quietly grateful for that. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the garden glowed under hundreds of tiny lanterns. Warm golden light danced across the white petals. Music drifted from a small speaker by the window, an old jazz tune, slow and wistful. Aunt Teresa approached Daniel with a playful glint. "So, you're the man who brought this garden back to life?" Daniel looked embarrassed. "I just helped a little." "A little, yet you turned this place into magic?" She chuckled. "I like modest men, but don't overdo it." Elena appeared, smiling. "Aunt Teresa, stop scaring him." Teresa winked and walked off, leaving the two standing under the golden lights. Elena said softly, "My grandmother believed in kind spirits. She thought they find us when we need them most." Daniel looked around at the shimmering lights reflected in her eyes. "Maybe she was right," he said. "Maybe she's here tonight." Elena stayed quiet, then handed him a white paper lantern. "Write your wish. When you let it go, the wind will take it where it belongs." Daniel hesitated, then wrote simply, "To be trusted again." Down by the bay, the waves shimmered under the moonlight. Together, they released the lanterns. Dozens of small lights floated away, drifting like silent souls into the night. Elena stood beside him, the wind brushing her hair. When he turned, her eyes caught the light of the lanterns. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the garden, but for reminding me what it feels like to be alive again." Daniel's voice was low, steady. "Maybe we're both learning how to believe again." The music slowed, laughter echoed softly from the distance. Elena looked at him, hesitant, then asked, "Would you dance with me?" "I'm not sure I remember how." "Me neither," she smiled. "Maybe we can forget together." They stood in the middle of the garden, under strings of light, moving gently to the rhythm. His hand rested lightly on her back, hers on his shoulder. No words, no promises, only two hearts finding the same rhythm. When the song ended, they didn't step apart. Elena looked up, whispering, "My grandmother used to say, some meetings aren't coincidences. They're messages from the universe." Daniel met her gaze. Then maybe the universe just sent me the most beautiful one I'll ever receive." Amid the shimmering lanterns, the sound of waves, and the scent of white roses, two broken souls smiled quietly, as if tonight hope had finally found its way back. That afternoon, after finishing the last flower pots, Daniel and Elena sat beneath the shade of the old oak in the garden. A soft breeze drifted by, carrying the scent of damp earth and newly opened roses. Elena poured him a glass of lemonade. "You know, Daniel, I think you were meant for this, but not just here, not just in my garden." Daniel smiled faintly. "Are you trying to get rid of me?" "Not at all," she said, shaking her head. "I just think people like you shouldn't keep their gifts hidden forever. I have a friend who works with the city's parks department. They're starting a new community green space project." He looked at her, surprised. "You really think they'd hire me?" "I do," Elena replied with quiet conviction. You have knowledge, passion, and above all, love for what you do. That's something no degree can give." Daniel sat in silence. He once stood in front of lecture halls, speaking about the language of plants with unshakable confidence. Now, after losing everything, the idea of returning to that world made his heart tremble. "I don't know," he said softly. "After all that's happened, I'm not sure anyone still believes in me." Elena placed her hand lightly on the table between them. "Then show them who you are again, not with words, but with the work you do, like you did today." A quiet pause hung in the air. The last ray of sunlight touched his hand, warm and steady. "I'll reach out to my friend tomorrow morning," Elena continued. "Just say you'll give it a try." Daniel looked around the garden, the place that had saved him from despair, that had taught him to believe again. "If that's a way to keep planting, and maybe replant my own life," he said with a small smile, "then I'll try." Elena nodded, her eyes gleaming. "And this garden will always have a place for you whenever you want to come back." He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not just encouragement, but a quiet promise. He didn't say another word, but deep down he knew. Tomorrow would be a new beginning, and she was the reason he was ready to take it. As he left the garden that evening, the scent of white roses lingered on his jacket. He turned back once, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw Elena watching from the porch, her hand resting over her heart, a silent promise that their paths would cross again. In the days after the lantern night, Seattle returned to its fine rain. Yet to Daniel Costa, the city felt brighter. He had started a new job at the Bay Ecological Center, helping to restore coastal wetlands. The work was hard, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. Each morning he arrived before sunrise, hands covered in mud, mind filled with sketches of new ecosystems. In the evenings, he cooked simple dinners for Sophia, meals that once felt like luxuries. One night, while Sophia worked on her homework at their small wooden table, Daniel noticed the old napkin pinned to the shelf, the one with Elena's handwriting. He smiled, snapped a picture of his tiny garden, and texted her, "The roses here are starting to bloom. Maybe they miss you." Her reply came almost instantly, "Or maybe they miss the man who taught them how to breathe." Attached was a photo. Elena's garden glowing white under morning light. Beneath it, she'd written, "My grandmother must be smiling." From then on, they exchanged messages often, photos, brief thoughts, fragments of their days. Each message felt like a quiet breath, a bridge between the lives they once had and the ones they were slowly building. One Saturday afternoon, Elena visited the Ecological Center. She brought apple pie and her warm smile. "I wanted to see what keeps you so busy." Daniel led her along the shoreline, where he and volunteers were replanting seagrass to restore the ecosystem. Waves lapped at their boots, mud clung to their clothes, but Elena didn't mind. She watched him work, the steady hands, focused eyes, the calm authority in his voice as he guided students. "You look happy here," she said as they paused by the water. Daniel nodded. "Maybe because for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Elena smiled, wind brushing her hair. "I think someone's found himself again." Daniel looked at her, a slow smile spreading. "And you? Still buried in galleries and deadlines?" "Some, yes." She hesitated. "But I've been offered a position to manage a community art center. They want me to create local exhibits and workshops. I'm thinking of using my grandmother's garden as the first venue." Daniel looked surprised, then smiled. "I could help redesign the space. merge art and nature together. Elena's eyes brightened. I'd love that. My grandmother would too. They stood quietly, watching the silver-gray water shimmer. A lone seagull glided across the horizon, free and sure. Later that afternoon, they returned to her garden. Together, they sketched plans, an outdoor exhibit area, the white rose section, and a small corner for Sophia, if she ever wanted to plant something of her own. As the sunset painted the trees gold, Elena said softly, "Funny, isn't it? All this started because of a loaf of bread." Daniel chuckled. Maybe the universe likes to use the smallest things to change entire lives. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You've changed, Daniel. You're not just surviving anymore." "And you," he replied, "you've learned to believe in what's ahead." They fell silent, listening to the waves. In the golden dusk, the garden seemed to breathe, alive again, just like them, after so many seasons of loss. One quiet weekend morning, pale sunlight slipped through the curtains of Daniel's small apartment. Sophia sat at the table, carefully coloring a picture of white roses. "Who's that for?" Daniel asked, pouring milk into her cup. "For Miss Elena. She loves roses, right, Dad?" Daniel smiled. "That's right. You have a good memory." "I want to see her garden. I want to know what real roses look like." He paused for a moment. He'd known this day would come sooner or later. "Then we'll go today," he said. Sophia clapped her hands, laughter filling their little home. By noon they arrived at the house by the bay. Elena was kneeling by the flower beds, wearing a wide hat, her gloves covered in dirt. When she looked up and saw them, her face lit with joy. "Well, look who's here," she said cheerfully, brushing off her hands. Sophia hid shyly behind her father, then offered a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you." Elena unfolded it, a picture of white roses outlined in soft gold crayon. "It's beautiful, Sophia. Thank you. I'll hang it right here," she said, pointing to the wooden wall near the porch. Sophia grinned and ran off to explore the garden as if it were already her own. Daniel watched her, warmth rising quietly in his chest. Elena stood beside him. "She's wonderful," she said softly. "She has your eyes." Daniel looked toward Sophia, who was crouching to pick up fallen petals. "She's the reason I'm still standing, after everything." "I understand," Elena nodded. "I used to think I'd never feel at peace again, but this garden, and you, changed that." Daniel froze at her words. He turned to her, her gaze calm, honest, and kind. He didn't reply, only smiled faintly and continued helping her with the soil. That afternoon, the three of them planted new rose bushes together. Sophia worked carefully, her tiny hands covered in earth, cheeks flushed from the sun. "What's this one called, Dad?" "White drift rose," Daniel answered. "Small, but strong." "Like me?" she asked with a sparkle in her eyes. Daniel laughed. "Exactly like you." Elena, standing nearby, couldn't help but smile. She snapped a photo. Daniel kneeling by the plant, Sophia laughing with dirt on her nose. A simple, perfect moment. When they finished, they rested beneath the old maple tree. Elena brought lemonade, their breath still quick from the work. "She's adorable," Elena said. "She reminds me of myself when I was her age." Daniel nodded, watching Sophia draw shapes in the dirt. "I used to fear she'd only remember the bad things, the divorce, the hard days. But maybe the best memories come from small moments like this." Elena was quiet for a while, her gaze steady and full of something he hadn't seen before. Not pity, but faith. "You're a good father, Daniel," she said gently, "and a man who deserves happiness." He looked at her, smiling softly. "Maybe I'm starting to believe that, because of you." Just then, a breeze passed, rustling the white petals. Sophia ran back, excited. "Miss Elena, look, I found a heart-shaped stone." Elena bent down, taking the smooth little rock. "Maybe it's a sign of good luck, a new heart." Sophia placed it in her hand. "I think it should stay here, with the garden." Daniel looked at them, his daughter, and the woman who had brought light back into both their lives. A gentle peace filled his chest, a family, fragile yet real. As dusk settled, the white roses glowed gold in the fading light, and Sophia's laughter mingled with the wind, like the quiet music of life beginning again. 3 months after that afternoon of planting, Elena's garden had completely transformed. The white roses were in full bloom, filling the air with a soft fragrance, and the outdoor exhibit space was ready for the grand opening of the Bayview Community Art Center. Elena stood among strings of golden lights and flickering candles. Daniel was arranging the last potted plants, while Sophia carefully placed a wooden sign that read, in her careful handwriting, "Welcome to the Garden of Hope." She turned proudly. "Miss Elena, did I spell everything right?" Elena bent down, fixing a small letter. "Perfect, Sophia." Daniel smiled, his gaze resting on the two of them, one small, one graceful, both the quiet warmth of his world. As the opening began, neighbors and friends arrived. The art pieces, paintings, sculptures, and floral installations were all inspired by nature and renewal. On the small stage, Elena spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you all for coming. This place used to be my grandmother's garden. She believed that even after loss, we can bloom again. Today, I dedicate this space to everyone learning how to start over, just like this garden did." Applause filled the air. Daniel watched from the back, pride flickering in his eyes. He knew how much courage it took for her to stand there. Later, as lights glowed softly over the garden, Sophia tugged on Elena's hand. "Miss Elena, can I show you the part I planted?" "Of course, sweetheart." She led them to a small patch where 3 young rose bushes were budding. A little sign read, "Planted by Sophia and Dad." Daniel knelt beside them, brushing a leaf. "They're growing faster than you," he teased. Sophia giggled, and Elena laughed softly. "Every time I come here, I see something new," Elena said, "not just in the garden, but in us." Daniel nodded. "I used to think peace was something far away, but now I think I'm living inside it." Elena was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "Maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's the person you choose to stand beside." Sophia looked up, eyes sparkling. "So that means you're going to stay with us forever?" Daniel chuckled. Elena blushed. "Well, if your dad agrees," she replied half playfully. Daniel looked at both of them, voice low and warm. "I think we both do." They laughed together. The night wind stirred the lights, scattering golden glimmers over the white petals. Sophia reached out, holding both their hands, her tiny fingers linking them together. Later, when the guests had gone, the 3 of them stayed behind. Elena cleared the empty glasses. Daniel gathered a few plants. Sophia had fallen asleep on the bench, her head resting on her father's jacket. Elena watched them, her heart swelling with a quiet tenderness. "They look so peaceful," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "It's been a long time since I've seen her sleep this soundly." "Maybe because she feels safe here," Elena said softly. "Maybe you do too." Daniel turned to her, his voice low and sincere. "I once thought my life was over. Then you appeared like an unexpected spring." Elena smiled, eyes glimmering under the warm light. "And I think I've finally found where I belong." Daniel said nothing more. He simply reached for her hand. Beneath the quiet Seattle night, they sat together, 2 people once broken, now gently learning to rebuild peace. Above them, the white roses swayed in the breeze, whispering blessings for a new beginning. Winter had passed gently, and Seattle welcomed another spring, the second spring since Daniel and Elena met. Their garden, now known as the Garden of Hope, had become a haven for neighbors, students, and children learning to plant life. Under the porch, Sophia sorted seed trays, her face glowing in the morning light. Elena stepped out of the wooden house with a pot of tea. "Have you picked your seeds yet?" "Yes, I'm planting yellow tulips," Sophia said proudly. Daniel, fixing the vine trellis, turned with a smile. "Yellow tulips, huh? Like our first spring together." Elena set down the tea and smiled. "I remember that day. You came with muddy hands and a basket of white roses." Daniel chuckled, warmth in his tone. "And you looked like a storm, angry but beautiful." "You still talk too much," she teased, unable to hide her smile. Sophia ran over, tugging their hands. "Mom, Dad, look, my roses from last year bloomed again." Neither corrected her. For a long time now, Mom and Dad had simply felt right.